Found my husband naked with his mom and then she punched me. Disclaimer is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. My mother-in-law is the most toxic, violent woman I've ever met. And she hates me because I married her perfect little boy. Everything started 5 years ago. My husband and I met on Hinge. Neither of us was looking for a serious relationship, but we ended up falling in love. We started going out on dates, and every time we would go on a date, we would end up just spending a week together. Eventually, I got my dream job and I moved to New York City. I was working in fashion and making 6 figures a year. As you can imagine, my life was amazing. He asked me to be his girlfriend and we decided to do long distance. It was totally fine for the first couple of months. He was the one that decided to drive 5 hours to come see me. 2 months later, out of nowhere, he decided to propose. But the thing is, I wasn't sure if I should say yes. We hadn't been together long, and he was already offering to move to New York City with me. My life was so good in New York, I didn't know if I wanted him to come be with me. When I said I wasn't sure, his mother called me to convince me to marry him. Part 2 is story time about how I found my husband naked with his mom and then she punched me. Disclaimers are not my story time. Send me on Instagram. My mother-in-law calls me to convince me to marry her son. And guess what? She managed to convince me, so I said yes. He ended up moving to my apartment in New York City 2 weeks later. That's when my personal nightmare began. My mother-in-law started coming over to our apartment every single weekend to plan the wedding. All she cared about planning was my husband's stuff. For example, she only wanted to go try on his suits. We didn't even talk about my wedding dress. Then this woman had the audacity to plan the whole menu around his favorite foods. One day she comes up to me and says, "This is the menu for the wedding," without even asking me. No, I was not about to have corn dogs on the menu. Since we had a spare bedroom in our apartment, she started to sleep over. And she would tell my husband to sleep with her because apparently she was scared at night. At this point, she's planning the wedding. My husband is sleeping with her and my family is paying for it. Part 3 is my husband naked with his mom and then she punched me. Disclaimer is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. After she took over planning our wedding, we finally got married. I was so busy with work that at that point, I just didn't care. For the next few years, she started coming over to our apartment at least once a month. And she would sleep over. And sometimes my husband would sleep with her. I told my husband that it was kind of weird that they slept together and he told me that it wasn't. That they were just really close. One night I'm sleeping and I hear noises coming from the guest bedroom. I know that they're sleeping in there, so I walk over and open the door. That's when I see them fully naked. And my husband had his arm around her shoulder. Then she runs over to me and starts punching me. And then my husband tells me to get out. Then he gave me some bullshit excuse about how they're recreating childbirth. I kicked her out of the apartment. And my husband got mad at me. I no longer have a relationship with her and I'm thinking about leaving my husband. She still comes to our apartment and just flat out ignores me. What should I do? My husband threatened to leave me if I didn't start paying for the bills. My husband is American and I'm Middle Eastern. And in my Middle Eastern culture, men pay for everything. If you marry a man, he will take care of you. He will pay for the bills so that you can focus on having children and taking care of the family. Those are values that I wanted in my relationship. A couple of years ago, my family and I moved to the US. Of course, my parents wanted me to date only Middle Eastern men because they knew that they were like this. But I ended up falling for an American guy. When he and I started dating, my parents spoke to him. They explained to him that in our culture, men are providers. They take care of the women, that women could be better mothers. He agreed to all of that. Now, I would say that he is very possessive and very jealous. When I decided that I was going to move to another state to study, he said not to because he was going to be a provider for me. Therefore, I didn't have to graduate from college. Biggest mistake of my life. Fast forward 2 years, he asks me to marry him and I say yes. My parents reminded him that once we got married, moved in together, he would be financially responsible for me. He kept agreeing to everything. You're never going to guess what happened next. Hey, part 2 is up. You can go watch it now. My loser husband threatened to leave me if I didn't start paying for the bills. After he confessed that he had spent all of our money, he said that I should be the one to get a new job. All of this after years that he promised my family that he would be a provider. Like I said in part 1, I'm Middle Eastern. Men in my culture are providers. But since my husband is American, he just didn't agree with that. After he suggested that I get a job, I told him that would be impossible. And that there was no way that I would be trying to get pregnant, and then have a child, all while working. The next words out of his mouth were, "Well, if you don't get a job, I'm just gonna have to divorce you. Because I already like my job, and I don't feel like getting a new one." And that was enough for me to start packing my bags and go back to my parents' house. But of course, he put up a huge fight. He started grabbing my suitcase and throwing it out of the way and wouldn't let me leave for 4 hours. I called my dad and he came to get me. And that's when I told my parents everything he had said. And it was enough for them to agree that I needed to leave him. As in love as I am, he led me on for years and lied to my family. Now, some of my friends think that I'm overreacting. That's just how things are where I'm from. Now tell me the truth. Do you think I'm overreacting? Should I leave his ass? My husband threatened to leave me if I didn't start paying for the bills. But when we got married, we asked our guests to give us money instead of gifts. My parents gifted us $50,000 for our wedding gift. Our idea was to use all of this wedding money as a down payment for a house. After the wedding, we opened up a joint account and put all the money in there. And we both had access to this money. Okay, so you're probably wondering what he does for a job. He works in construction part-time. He could never land a full-time job. So altogether, he was making about $2,000 a month. The problem is, I didn't know this until we got married. Because before that, he was using his credit cards to pay for for everything, making me and my parents think that he was earning a lot more. Part of me has to take some responsibility because I could have asked him directly how much money you earned. I just assumed it was a lot of money. As soon as we got married, we were trying to get pregnant, and he was paying for everything. At least that's what it looked like. A few months later, he confesses that he had been using all of our wedding money to pay for bills. Not just bills, mortgage, his new car, and a whole new setup because he wanted to become a gamer. We only had $5,000 left in that account. That's when he asked me if I was willing to get a job. Maybe you gotta go to part 2 with. Am I an asshole for lying to my boyfriend about being pregnant just to keep him in a relationship? Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I repeat, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. My boyfriend and I have been together for almost 5 years. Granted, we did break up throughout those 5 years. With all the breakups, we've actually been together for about 3 years. I've never considered myself an obsessive person, but when it comes to him, something just takes over me. Here's some of the reasons why we broke up. At first, he didn't want to be in a relationship even though I begged him, which I know was so dumb of me. So he eventually broke up with me and told me that he didn't want anything serious. But he kept on calling me every single week because he wanted the dirty. Instead, I started going out on other dates and I would flaunt it all over my social media. And this worked. It made him super jealous and he came right back to me. Called me up one day and told me that he wanted me back. The second time we broke up, I caught him talking to some girls on Facebook. When I confronted him, he broke up with me. Told me I was too nosy and that he needed to live his life as a single man. We finally got back together. I told him that it was for marriage. He said yes, that he would eventually ask me to marry him. A few months ago, he started acting really cold towards me. He would barely call me, and when we were together, he would never touch me. That's when I started digging in his phone and I found that he was talking to some girls on Instagram. But I knew that if I confronted him, I would risk him breaking up with me again. So I did the next logical thing. I waited until I saw him again and I told him that I was pregnant. I even started to cry to make him feel like I was happy. His face turned completely white and he asked me if I was sure. I said yes. Aren't you happy, baby? Part 2 is up. Am I the asshole for lying to my boyfriend about being pregnant just so that I could keep him in a relationship? Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I repeat, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. That's when he started to cry. Remember, I don't even have a pregnancy test to show or anything. But surprisingly, he didn't ask for proof of my pregnancy. He just kept crying on the couch. I asked him if he was happy, but clearly he was not. But he lied and said, yeah, of course I'm happy. Seeing how vulnerable he was, I took advantage of the situation and I brought up marriage. I told him we should get engaged soon so that we could tell his family. Then he said, are you sure you want to get married? And I said, of course, we're gonna have a baby. Then he sat there for a minute and thought about it. Finally, he got down on one knee and said, do you want to marry me? I said yes! And this time I cried for real. All my dreams were coming true. After that, things started moving really fast. We invited both our families to my apartment and we hosted a dinner. We broke the news to them that I was pregnant. Again, nobody asked for proof of the pregnancy though. Our families were so happy and excited. That very same night, he gave me a beautiful engagement ring. His mom even started planning the baby shower. Let me remind you, I'm actually not pregnant. So I had to come up with a plan. You'll never guess what I did. Part 3 is up. Am I an asshole for lying to my boyfriend about being pregnant just to keep him in a relationship? Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I repeat, this is not my story time. It was sent me on Instagram. His mom started planning the baby shower and there was no turning back. Even my mom got involved in the planning of the baby shower. So like I said, I'm really not pregnant at this point. So I started trying to get pregnant, but my damn boyfriend just wouldn't touch me. I decided to check his phone again and saw that he was still talking to some girls on Instagram. So I decided to confront him at this point. I mean, we are engaged and I'm supposedly pregnant with his baby. I confronted him and he just got angry at me. He said that if he was gonna marry me and have a baby with me, he would need to talk to other girls and that was not a negotiation for him. Then he confessed that he was seeing 2 other girls on the side and that there was no way he was gonna stop seeing them and that I couldn't do anything about it. But his confession actually made me fall out of love with him. Now I'm planning to break up with him. But what do I do about the fake pregnancy? I do want to make him pay for what he said to me, but I don't want to hurt our families either. Should I just come clean? What should I do? My father-in-law is forcing my husband to break up with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. This is a 3-part story time and I'm doing a full face of pink makeup today. My husband and I have been married for 2 years. Now, we did get married very, very young. By very young, I mean I was 18 and he was 19. When we started dating in high school, his dad was totally against the relationship. See, my husband was super popular. He played on the football team. All the girls chased him. He also played basketball and was perfect at everything he did. As you can imagine, was extremely strict with him. He was not even allowed to go out on weekends. Me, on the other hand, my parents are pretty much hippies. They let me do whatever I want. We're all very spiritual. My parents have full trust in me. Because of this, I make smart decisions. I actively seek my parents' advice. I even told my parents I lost my virginity when I did. And we had a big conversation about it. It was not dramatic. It was not like, oh, you shouldn't have done that. They just support me in everything I do. Now, my husband's parents are not the same. They tell him not to do a lot of things. They try to control him. So as we were dating in high school, his dad kept telling him to break up with me. He claimed that I was holding him back and that because of me, he spent less time training, which technically, yes, is true. But at the same time, you cannot stop your son from experiencing human relationships. In fact, he actually broke up with me for 2 weeks, but then we got back together in secret. Everything culminated when he asked me to marry him right after graduation. His parents were absolutely against it, but my parents were all for it. You guessed it, go to part 2. My father-in-law wants my husband to break up with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me on Instagram. This is a 3-part story time, and I'm doing a full face of pink makeup. When he asked me to marry him right out of high school, his parents absolutely freaked. They went to my parents' house and told me off for saying yes. In other words, they were completely blaming me for the whole thing, as if their own son didn't go buy a ring and ask me to marry him. He even did a beautiful proposal, which he had been planning for months. But at this point, his parents didn't even know that we were boyfriend and girlfriend. When they came to my house, his mom, my now mother-in-law, started crying and yelling at me. She told me that I was ruining their family, that I was trying to steal her son, and that all I really cared about was their money. By the way, my parents were middle class, but we were not destitute. His parents are very rich. They own several businesses. But of course, I'm not after their money. That's when they said that if we did end up getting married, I would have to sign a prenup. And I said, yeah, I want to marry him because I'm in love. At this point, his parents knew they couldn't stop us. We were going to get married with or without their approval. But thankfully, his parents came around and let us get married. We had a quaint, small wedding. It was so magical. But his parents wanted him to go to college to play football. In other words, they wanted him to be the next Tom Brady. They made him train for hours, and they didn't even let us live together for the first year we were married. And because they were supporting him, he couldn't say no. They had us on a schedule. Could only see him for about 2 to 3 hours a day. And we were married. 2 years later, he's playing for a football team. But his parents keep thinking that I'm dragging him down. So now they're trying to convince him to leave me. Go to part 3. My father-in-law is trying to convince my husband to divorce me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, and this is the final part of the 3-part story time. I'm doing a full face of pink makeup. After a year of us being married, his parents did not allow us to live together because he needed to focus on football. So obviously, I was living with my parents. I was focusing on my own studies, but his parents did allow us to see each other 2 to 3 hours a day. Now, you might think my husband is a total pushover, but let me explain something. His parents paid for all of his training and his entire college tuition. They gave him the best of everything. He got sports massages every single day. They even installed a cold plunge in their backyard. They also had a full gym setup where he and his teammates would go work out every single day in their house. Obviously, he did not have time for little old me. After a year of this, I couldn't take anymore. I wanted to be with my husband. So I gave him an ultimatum. That he tell his parents that he and I wanted to live together. That's all I wanted. I was even willing to pay for half of the rent. And he told his parents, they said fine. And they bought us a house. Obviously under my husband's name, not mine. Fast forward another year up until now. I've heard his dad tell him on several occasions that he needs to divorce me. That he could find a much prettier wife once he becomes bigger in the NFL. And I walked in on his mom telling him that maybe I can't even have kids. And that he should have me checked. My parents-in-law hate me. I sometimes feel like I am holding him back. They make us miserable. My parents think I should just walk away from the marriage, but I'm too in love. Should I confront my parents-in-law? Help me think of what I should say to them.
Storytime about how my boyfriend got myself and another girl pregnant at the same time. So a little background information, I was 18 and a senior in high school whenever this all happened. And I've been dating my boyfriend, who we're going to call Ivan, since I was 15 years old. And he was truly my first love, and everything was going great until our senior year. Ivan started acting super weird out of nowhere, ignoring my calls and going out way more than usual without me. And then one day, another girl answers his phone whenever I called. And when I confronted him about it, he said that it was his sister playing a prank. And I ignored these red flags, of course, because what are we? Colorblind. Anyway, soon after this, I realized that I'm pregnant, and Ivan was thrilled about this. Well, fast forward a little bit after I find out that I'm pregnant, he casually admits to me one day that he did it on purpose because he was afraid that I would leave him whenever I went off to college. Fast forward, things got worse when I found out that he had got another girl pregnant, but she was 7 months along. Not only that, but his mom thought that we had been broken up. So I end things with him. Like for part 2. Part 2 about how my boyfriend got myself and another girl pregnant at the same time. So like I said, he admitted that he got me pregnant so that way I wouldn't leave him whenever I went to college. So I broke up with him, and while I'm dealing with my pregnancy, I lost one of my closest friends, and then I lost my baby 6.5 months in. But despite all of this, I finished high school and got into college and started volunteering at a hospital. And y'all will not believe this shit. The one day, I run into Ivan at the hospital that his girlfriend is giving labor in. And he has the nerve to sit there and apologize and say that he wanted our family back. And that's whenever I told him, sir, our baby's gone. Like, I lost that shit. So then later, he called me and he asked if I was pregnant again. But I just blocked him and his whole family after they kept trying to guilt trip me into getting back with him, even though he literally had a baby with another girl. Fast forward, over a decade later, I've graduated, I have a great job, a house, and I'm engaged to the love of my life, and we're planning to start a family, and I've healed through a lot of therapy. Ivan's married and has kids, but he's still living this drama-filled life. Storytime about how I crashed my dad's really expensive car. So a little background information. My mom had just got remarried to my stepdad 3 years ago, and he was this rich asshole who owned a bunch of food trucks and thought he was the shit. Well, at the time I also had a boyfriend. And we had only been dating for like a month and a half. But my boyfriend would always beg me to let him drive my stepdad's car. And I always said no because that was like his child. Like he had children. He could care less about them. His car was more important. Anyway, so the one weekend my parents are out of town and one of my friends was throwing a graduation party. So that whole day my boyfriend was trying to talk me into taking the car. And I already knew where my stepdad hid the keys. So I just decided I wouldn't drink that night and I would just take the car. He kept asking me if he could drive, but clearly I said no, because this kid literally told me that he crashed the first 2 cars that he had. So we get to the party, we're having a good time, and one of my friends tells me that everybody's taking pictures with my car outside. Like for part 2. Part 2 about how my best friend cheated on his girlfriend with me. So like I said, the one night I was at his house and he was on my phone and he was asking me who all these guys were on my Snapchat. And I told him that I had been talking to them and he was just being super toxic. He was talking shit on every single one of them. So eventually I started dating this guy Trey, and after that he texted me saying that I was gross and everything else, when the next day he literally got a girlfriend. But weirdly enough, he didn't block me that time. He actually started texting me more, saying how him and his girlfriend were so happy together, da-da-da-da-da. And I'm like, him, I would be supportive. Well, the one night at 2 a.m. he came over my house and he was like, I don't have feelings for my girlfriend. And I'm like, okay, then why are you with her? And then he has the nerve to say, don't you get that I like you? Like, really? Well, eventually we cut off all communication and he was still with this girl. Well, the one night he asked me to come over and talk, and we ended up doing the nasty. And then he blocked me on everything after he said we should both leave our girlfriends and boyfriends. Well, I ended up telling his girlfriend what we did, and they also come to my family cookouts. Part 3 about how my ex-boyfriend accused me of cheating on him on an all-girls trip. So like I said, I received over 100 messages from him. He got a picture of me dancing with one of the boys and said, we're done. And then at 1 a.m, he's like, I miss you so much. Please don't leave me. Like, I've been doing so bad while you were gone. So of course I didn't accept his apology and I just blocked him on all my social media. And the next day I wake up to messages on my Instagram, my Snapchat, my Facebook. Like, who even uses that? Unless you're talking to family. Well, then Carson decides to tell everybody at my school about how I'm a lying, cheating scumbag. And now, 3 years later, no good guy from my school wants to date me. So now whenever I'm talking to a guy, I have to make sure that they're not affiliated with Carson in any way. But low-key, I had a really good glow-up, so all the hot boys want to talk to me now. And Carson's pretty much still a scumbag. Part 2 about how my ex-boyfriend accused me of cheating on him on an all-girls trip. So like I said, I started distancing myself from him because he became too attached and was just way too toxic. Well, I was also in a lot of clubs in school, and a few of them would require me to go on trips. Well, the one that I went on was an all-girls trip, and before I left, I texted Carson letting him know that I wouldn't have my phone all week. Well, on the last night of my trip, there was a girls and boys dance. There was like a group of boys from a different school that we were meeting up with, and I tried staying back at the cabin, but they wouldn't let me. So we started doing dances that required partners, so I was pretty much forced to dance with one of the boys. Well, when I came back home, I got 100 texts from Carson calling me a bunch of nasty names, and you can probably guess them. And somebody got a picture of me dancing with one of the boys, and Carson sent it to me and said, we're done. So after that, I just ignored him. And then literally that night at 1 a.m., he was texting me saying, I miss you, please come back to me, like for part 3. Storytime about how my ex-boyfriend accused me of cheating on an all-girls trip. So a little background information, I was 14 or 15 around the time, and it was the summer of my freshman year. So within the last few weeks of my 8th grade year, one of the more popular boys asked me out, and we're gonna call him Carson. I wasn't like super popular at the school, but I was like a medium maybe. But I was raised in a super strict household, where the only phone that I pretty much had was one that was able to call 911 and my parents. And I especially was not allowed to be talking to boys. So Carson had the great idea of giving me his old phone, and throughout the summer, I would text him on there. Well, I started realizing him getting really toxic. Anytime that he would see my Snapchat location change, he would be like, where are you going? Why didn't you tell me you were going here? So I started distancing myself a little bit from him. Also because our relationship was just moving way too fast. Within the first month of us dating, he was talking about wanting to marry me. Like for part 2. Part 2 about the worst day of my life. So like I said, me being stupid, I introduced her to my boyfriend. Well, after that, Cameron started acting really weird. Like him and I, we would literally hang out with each other 24/7. And now he was always too busy for me and we would only talk at school. And because I was in all the smart classes and stuff, I would go over to his house to tutor him. Because, I was like the one who was winning every single fucking award for being smart. Well, I came over on the day that I would usually tutor him. And when I went over there, his mom was like, oh, he's busy. He's out with his friends. So then I went home and I got bored and I opened Instagram. Well, I see that he's at a party with Sky and they didn't even invite me. So I asked him about it and he said, oh, it was her and her boyfriend's party. So I was like, that wasn't really an excuse for why you didn't invite me. So he apologized and I forgave him. Well, 5 weeks later, I found out that him and her did the nasty and she got pregnant. And then there was a rumor going around that they made out in the bathroom. So I blocked both of them and never saw them again. Story time about the worst day of my life. So a little background information. I was 16 at the time, and I was either in 8th grade or 9th grade, but I really don't remember. And I had this boyfriend who we are going to call Cameron. We had been dating for 3 years, but before him and I got together, we were best friends. Well, I also was in a friend group with myself, Amber, and this girl named Sky. Now, I wouldn't really call Sky a pick-me girl. She was more of a jealous best friend. For example, the one day we went shopping for dresses, and I picked this one out that I really liked and that looked super good on me. Amber was like, OMG, you look so beautiful. And then Sky, she was like, that dress is ugly and it makes you look fat. Well, after that, I told her I didn't care what she said and that I was going to get the dress anyways. Well, she didn't like the fact that I wasn't going to listen to her, so she didn't talk to me for 2 whole weeks. And then after, she texted me saying that she forgives me, even though I didn't apologize, but okay. Well then, me being stupid, I introduced her to my boyfriend. Bad idea, like for part 2. Story time about how I was almost kidnapped. So a little background information, I was 13, and it was the summer going into 9th grade. I was on a road trip with my family, and we needed to stop for some gas. So we stopped at some random gas station, and we see this lady get out of her car and walk in. No big deal though. So we're inside and we're waiting in line to use the bathroom. So we were in the front of the line and then that lady was behind us. And then there were a few people behind her. So as we're standing in line, she FaceTimes some guy. And then she starts pointing the camera at people around the store. And she would be like, oh, do you like this? And he would say yes or no. Well, then she points the phone at me. And then he goes, yeah, that's the one. And my mom and I were super creeped out about this because she was being super loud and she was taking a really long time at this gas station. So my mom goes into the bathroom and then she starts to talk to me. She starts asking how old I am, where I'm from, and if my mom and I were here with anybody else. Like for part 2 about my shitty ex-boyfriend. So like I said, the original plan was for us to go together to his house after school. But I was like, I'm going to be spending the whole week over there. I should probably pack some clothes and get a shower. So after school, he drove me to my house. And he said that his parents wanted to have dinner together, so he had to go back to his house. And he would pick me up later. So when I got to my house, I got ready and everything, blah, blah, blah. And by this time, it was like 8 o'clock. So I kept texting and calling him, asking him where he's at, if he's coming to get me still. Then I realized that none of my text messages were going through. So then I go to text him on Snap. And what do you know? I couldn't find him on there. And then I call him off my mom's phone. He answers the phone and hangs up right away. Well, we were supposed to have a little party at his house too, that all of my friends were going to. So I texted every single one of them. None of them answered the phone. And I remembered that my one friend had shared her location with me before. So I went and looked at her location and where was she at? My boyfriend's house. So while I sat at home crying that whole week, he was throwing parties and cheating on me with my friends. And when we went back to school, he acted like we were never in a relationship. Story time about my shitty ass ex-boyfriend. So a little background information. My ex and I have been dating for about 2 years. And throughout those 2 years, he was a dick. He would cheat on me, talk to other girls more than me, but of course I pretended that everything was perfect in my relationship. I would brag to all these people about how my relationship was so good, blah, 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 and everything else. Because it's embarrassing whenever bitches can talk shit because your relationship is very toxic. Like, listen to this bullshit. The whole 2 years we were dating, I had over 10 girls DM me on Instagram saying that they screwed my boyfriend at his house. I never confronted him about it. I was just one of those girls that cared way too much about what everybody else thought. Okay, now fast forward. And it was a Friday at school, and Thanksgiving break was the following day. And him and I have this whole plan to spend the whole break together, because literally a week before that, he was on vacation in North Carolina for 2 whole weeks. Well, instead of going with him after school, I decided to go home, get an overnight bag like for part 2. Part 2 about how I crashed my dad's very expensive car. So like I said, everybody's taking pictures of the car, but I decided to let it go at first. I mean, there was one point where I went outside just so that way I could kind of let everybody know, hey, you're taking pictures with my car. Well, half an hour later, my boyfriend and I decided to leave, and he's obliterated. Like, we probably got 50 feet from her house, and then I had to stop the car so that way he could get out and throw up in somebody's yard. Anyway, so he gets in the car, we're on the way back to my house, and my house was like a 20-minute drive away. Well, we were 5 minutes from my house. At this one intersection, I get a green light and I go to make a right, and I accidentally hit a car turning out of the bar parking lot. So I'm literally freaking the fuck out. And my boyfriend's in the seat next to me crying for some reason. So the guy in the other car calls the cops. The cops show up, they call my stepdad and my mom. My boyfriend went to the hospital, he had alcohol poisoning. Well, my boyfriend told his mom that it was all my fault and I'm grounded for 6 months.